Washington Journal continues.
Independent Institute Senior Fellow Ivan Eland is on your screen. He studies the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the powers of both. Mr. Eland, when it comes to declaring a national emergency, from where does a president derive that specific power?
Well, that's very interesting because I think the framers of the Constitution would frown on any declaration of emergency power. This is sort of a thing that's developed over time as the executive has become much more powerful than the framers had intended. The framers of the Constitution, to give a little background, they sort of rejected the national emergency paradigm because the American Constitution is not set up to be efficient in legislation. People always criticize Congress or the government in Washington for not being more efficient in passing things, but of course the system is designed to slow things up. The system of checks and balances was primarily to spread out power so that you don't have tyranny. And that was not only the tyranny of the executive, because they had the King George model of Britain in mind, but also legislative tyranny because of the British Parliament they felt was a tyrannical body as well, effect on them. So what they did was, the only thing that resembles a national emergency in the original Constitution is that they can suspend, not erase, habeas corpus during invasions or insurrections. Now those are pretty dire circumstances, and they don't mention a general national emergency because I think they would have been very uncomfortable with it. This emergency, declarations of national emergency have actually been trivialized, and they were building up in the early 70s. We had, I think, hundreds of them. I think almost 500 at once. So this National Emergencies Act of 1976 was actually designed to sunset some of those and rein in the practice. Well, it reined in to some extent because now we only have 30, and we had 59 since then, and some of them have gone away, but we have about 31 right now. So one might ask, well, is this all that serious? Well, most of these emergencies have been used to sanction other countries, and there's been largely an agreement. There's been abuse by the executive, but Congress has abdicated its authority by allowing this to happen. So we've sort of trivialized these things.
Go back to 1976. Why did it come to a head there? You mentioned the number of national emergencies, but why did Congress finally decide to step in here?
Well, this was the Watergate era. This was in 1976 after the Nixon abuse of power and that era. So Congress was trying to step in and control this. That's when the push of congressional pushback, and we may get some congressional pushback in the wake of the Trump administration. But this is not a Trump administration problem. This has been going on for quite some time. And we've also seen executive overreach, and that's what my book is about, the rogue presidency, war in the rogue presidency. And I would say that the rogue presidency started under George W. Bush, continued under Obama, and we're now continuing that with Trump. And the reason I call it that is because executives have usurped even more power. George W. Bush had he said he had the inherent power to violate anti-torture laws. He domestic surveilled. He suspended habeas corpus for terrorism suspects. He created military commissions, which are nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Then we go to Obama. He had several episodes of flagrantly getting money without congressional appropriations, which is what we have here. The Libyan War, the Affordable Care Act, and then, of course, also the Clean Power and regulations and other things. So this is sort of a unique episode, but we can discuss why it's unique. But we've had this trend of executive power really amping up. We had the imperial presidency starting in Truman, which was way past what the founders had intended. And now I think after 9/11, we have the rogue presidency. And this is not a partisan observation. It's just looking at the record.
Ivan Eland with us, author and senior fellow at the Independent Institute, will be with us until the top of the hour, till our program ends today. If you want to call in and join this discussion, phone lines as usual, Republicans 202-748-8001. Democrats can call in at 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. For viewers who don't know, what is the Independent Institute?
We're a public policy think tank. We're actually headquartered in California, and we look at all aspects of public policy. And by the name of the Institute, we try not to take a partisan stance on things.
You mentioned your concern about the president's emergency declaration on Friday. Yesterday on the Sunday show, Stephen Miller, one of the president's top aides, he was on Fox News Sunday, defended the president's state of emergency. Here's what he had to say.
This authority specifically refers to the use of military construction funds. Other emergencies, for example, were declared to promote.
I mean, if you want to talk about military constructions, do you know how many times military construction has been invoked as a national emergency?
That one was in
twice.
Right.
Twice. Once by George H.W. Bush during the middle of the Gulf War, and the second time by George W. Bush right after 9/11.
Chris, this
is hardly comparable to either of those.
Can you name one foreign threat in the world today, outside this country's borders, that currently kills more Americans than the threats crossing our southern border?
You know, the joy of this is I get to ask you questions you don't get to ask me.
The answer is no.
But then answer my question. Can you name one case where a president has asked Congress for money, Congress has refused, and the president has then invoked national powers to get the money anyway?
Well, this current situation...
Just yes or no, sir?
The current situation pertains specifically to the Military Construction Authority.
I'm just asking, has there been a single case where Congress asked for money for military construction, Congress said no, and
the meaning of the statute, Chris, is clear on its own terms. If you don't like the statute, or members of Congress don't like the statute...
Would you agree the answer is no? There hasn't been a single case like this.
But the premise of your question is also false, because Congress has appropriated money for construction of border barriers consistently. This is part of a national security mission.
Ivan Eland, watching that interview yesterday, your thoughts?
Well, I don't think they made a very good defense of the position. I think this is a unique episode, because not only did Trump appropriate, or he's going to appropriate these funds himself rather than going through the Constitution, which says that no money must be drawn from the Treasury unless it's appropriated by Congress. This is not going to be, that's not going to fulfill that constitutional requirement. But I think the key thing is the president is doing this against Congress's wishes. And we had that in the case of the 1952 Truman episode with the Youngstown Steel case, where that's why the Supreme Court overruled Truman at the time, because this was not only going against a vacuum. In other words, Congress had an act. In this case, Congress has said, no, we don't want to do this. And if you remember, during the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra thing, one of the big problems is they took money and raised money after the Congress directly told them not to. Now, the Iran-Contra was much more serious because they did it in secret. Trump is just blatantly doing it, and I think that's the key problem here. But we don't know how the courts are going to rule, because the courts also have deferred to the president in addition to Congress over time. And in immigration and national security, particularly national security, they've basically rolled over. They didn't used to do that, and so we don't know how the courts are going to rule. But if they rule constitutionally, they probably should overrule this.
Again, phone lines are open if you want to join this conversation about presidential powers, emergency declarations specifically. It is 202-748-8001 if you're a Republican, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents, 202-748-8002. Ian's up first, an independent from Florida. Go ahead.
Hi, Ivan. My name is Ian Mooney. I'm 26, and I've been keeping up with politics as much as I can since about 2004. And I just wanted to know what you personally feel is a good decision and good opportunity to actually utilize executive power as a president.
I'm unable to hear.
The question he asked was, when would be a good time to use executive power as a president? Do you personally think when would be a time to step in if we're talking about emergency declarations? When should they do it?
Well, I think it has to be under an extreme circumstance. There actually has to be an emergency. That's the other issue. Is this really an emergency? I think Trump admitted in his Rose Garden speech that he didn't really need to do it. And I think that's going to be a problem for him in court. The court still may give it to him. But I think it has to be under an extreme circumstance. And we've had a history of this being abused. So he's not the first one to do this. He's the first one, I think, to take money over congressional objections, and that's a step further. But you really have to. I don't believe in. I'm sort of a very strict constructionist. I don't think the Constitution allows national emergencies, and if we want to do that, then we should amend the Constitution, which probably isn't going to happen. So I think the executive should basically execute the laws that Congress passes, and I think that's why many, even Republicans, are very uncomfortable with this, because if you're a conservative, executive power is the government these days, because 99% of the employees of the federal government work for the executive branch, and you can't be for small government if you're for executive power. You just can't do it. I mean, it's a contradiction, and I think I would say we should stay away from this entirely. I mean, that's probably not going to happen, but it's certainly, the abuse just keeps getting worse, and I think Congress really has to do something. But we see the partisanship eroding the checks and balances that Madison put into the Constitution. Madison actually said that the biggest power that the Congress has is money, and that's still true, but that's eroded over time as well.
Michael is on our line for Democrats from Florida as well. Michael, go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned the 1976 Act. I believe it was passed in reference to Gerald Ford's action, the Maya Grass incident in 1975. Please review those two events and tell me if I'm correct.
Well, that was a triggering event, but the basic problem was that Nixon had run roughshod over the emergency process, and not only Nixon, but the Nixon administration was actually the triggering event. But you had all these emergencies. I think there were like 470 emergency declarations of emergencies that were in effect, and Congress said, this is an abuse, and we're pushing back. It was you can say it's triggered by any one incident, but the real problem was they felt that Nixon was usurping too much power in Vietnam and here at home, and they wanted to push back, and they pushed back in a number of ways with the War Powers Resolution and other things, but this was one of the things. The National Emergencies Act of 1976 was actually trying to reduce the emergencies, but they didn't really define emergencies very carefully. In fact, there's no definition, so the abuse continues at a lower level.
Some information on what's actually in the National Emergencies Act of 1976. It notes that the president has the discretion to declare an emergency, must specify which powers that he intends to use, must report to Congress every 6 months on the emergency-related costs of that declaration. The emergencies must be renewed each year, and Congress can end an emergency by passing a joint resolution. Of course, the president can veto that, and they can try to override the president's veto. On that last point, has that situation ever happened?
No, I mean, Congress hasn't even reviewed some of these things. When I talk about executive usurpation of power, the real problem is Congress's abdication. The founders of the country clearly wanted to make Congress the dominant branch of the three branches, but they were scared of legislative tyranny, so they actually included an independent executive to sort of check the Congress. Well, of course, our current system is that the executive has much more power than the Congress, and the Congress power had waned because of all the wars in the 20th century primarily, and other crises like the Depression, et cetera, but mainly wars. And that's what my book focuses on, how the presidency has usurped a lot of power. And this is only one example of it. And as I say, this has been a continuing problem.
The book on your screen, War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Republic After Congressional Failure, out on May the 1st, if you want to take a look. Phyllis is in Kansas City, a Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. What I was wanting to ask him was about President Obama. Didn't he do an executive order and take our tax-paying money for the DACA program?
Yes, this was, as I mentioned before, Obama did quite a few executive orders, and the reason was he had a divided Congress, so Congress wasn't giving him what he wanted. He did it on DACA, the Clean Power regulations, and the Libyan war, et cetera. And so it was just one of many things that he did. And so, but of course, George Bush did a lot as well. I mentioned the torture, the domestic surveillance, the military commissions, and the suspension of habeas corpus. So he did a lot of things as well to usurp executive power. And in fact, Bush claimed inherent power during warfare to, he claimed the power to go against congressionally passed laws, such as the ones on torture. So we've seen a bipartisan erosion of the power of Congress, and they really haven't done much to push back. Now, I think you're seeing more pushback than we saw the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, and that in large part was the results of the election and the election of the Democratic majority in the House. So we'll see what happens, but I think even the Republicans are becoming more willing to push back now.
What is your thoughts on the pushback from non-congressional actors here? Some news on that front this morning. This from the USA Today wrap-up about it. California's Democratic Attorney General Xavier Becerra said yesterday that he will definitely and immediately file a lawsuit against the Trump administration to contest the declaration of national emergency. The story also wrapping up a few other of those lawsuits, including one from the liberal watchdog group Public Citizen filing a federal lawsuit on Friday. After President Trump's announcement, the group argues that President Trump exceeded his authority and disregarded the separation of powers in the Constitution. Another lawsuit filed by the watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics. It argues that the White House did not provide the supporting documents needed to justify the national emergency declaration.
Yeah, I think many groups, including the attorneys general of 6 states, and maybe more, are going to hit this from very, very different directions. The groups are coming at it from all sides, and I guess it's sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what the courts will shake out. I mean, it could very well be that Trump will be right in that the lower courts will, stop this or delay it, and the Supreme Court will eventually come through for him. But we'll have to see. I mean, this is a pretty flagrant violation of the congressional will, and I think that's the key item. And the other item will be, well, is this a real emergency, which is not, and will they ping him on that? But as I say, over time, the courts have really rolled over on all presidents on immigration, and especially national security, and he's claiming really both issues here.
Kathy is in Arkansas, a Republican. Good morning.
Good morning. You know, it's surprising to me that these in Congress, President Trump, he tried with them and they won't help him just because he's President Trump. And just like this man said, Obama, he did it. Well, nothing was said about Obama doing it. And, you know, the American people were tired of all this mess. That's all they do is go against him. And I believe it is an emergency. We need that wall. Thank you.
Mr. Eland.
Well, I think that the facts are that the people coming across has dramatically decreased since 2000 and really since the last 50 years. And also, most of the drugs come through the ports of entry, not barren stretches of desert or mountainous terrain. And it's so it's costly to build a wall there when not much is happening. And I think the idea that the people are flooding over, they've had caravans, but those are sort of refugees with families coming from Central America. So I really disagree with that it's a genuine emergency. And I think this is just one of many times that the executive has claimed an emergency. If we continue to live in the fantasy world, I think we're going down to letting the executive do whatever he wants. The real danger here is that Trump or some president that comes after him is going to just say, well, the Congress won't act, so I have to. Anytime a president says that, it's unconstitutional. The Congress is supposed to be the primary legislative body of the United States. The executive should be executing. All his executive orders should be carrying out laws that Congress has passed. If he's doing executive orders like Obama did, or as Trump is declaring a national emergency, that's a very questionable constitutional muster, and it doesn't pass muster. And I think what needs to happen here is this needs to go down by the courts, and it's not a partisan thing. I think it needs to stop from both Democratic and Republican presidents.
About a half an hour left with Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute on this President's Day. If you want to join the conversation, Republicans, it's 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. Or you can join us on social media like Jim did, who wants to talk about the history of some of these issues when it comes to the imperial presidency or rogue presidency. Jim saying FDR gave rise to an overreaching executive branch. We'd not be in so many of our current messes if the clock could be turned back to a pre-FDR federal government. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that, but I think you need to go back even further. What really caused big government in the United States was World War I and Woodrow Wilson taking over the economy. This always usually starts in war, and FDR used the Depression as an excuse, but of course the Depression was caused by after effects from World War I, and also the war itself. The U.S. government took basically put its tentacles into the government, and so many of the New Deal programs arose from war agencies that were brought back, and some of the people who ran them were brought back during the Depression. So we converted an international crisis, which is debatable also in World War I, and we moved it to a domestic crisis, which was the Great Depression. And yes, I agree. Roosevelt created the office of the executive, the executive office of the president. So the president has his own bureaucracy within the larger federal bureaucracy. And so I think that is in part correct. FDR did give us a big government originally, and Woodrow Wilson gave him the template before that to do exactly that. And so we saw some usurpation of the government then, and also during World War II as well.
Since we're going down the historical road, can you talk about the history of presidents actually suspending habeas corpus, using that from the Constitution?
Well, we saw it in the Civil War. Lincoln did it illegally, and that has been a precedent. But of course, we had a hot Civil War going, and he started doing it in Maryland first, and then it went up the East Coast, way away from the theaters of war. So we can see how these things creep along. And of course, Grant also did it in the Reconstruction era. So this was set. Presidents don't usually do this. Now, George Bush did it partially in the War on Terror because he did it for terrorism suspects. They didn't, and a habeas corpus, for your viewers who are not so familiar with it, is just your ability, which this right goes way back into English law. You get to challenge your detention. So if the government throws you in jail, you can say, file a writ of habeas corpus and say, why are you charging me, and why am I in jail? And you can challenge it in court. And so when this happens, it's really a bedrock of Western rights. And the Constitution says that only the Congress can suspend habeas corpus, and only in times of invasion or insurrection. Now that's a pretty high standard to meet. And neither 9/11 did not satisfy that, but Bush has done it anyway. And he was challenged in court, and they built a few more rights for these defendants, but they're still not up to speed. And then Obama continued this, and Trump has continued it as well. So we're still under a suspension of habeas corpus, and this does not meet the constitutional standard.
To Hartford, Connecticut, Gladys is an independent. Good morning.
Morning. I have two quick questions. Do you think Russia and our other anti-allies are having a good time smiling with the chaos that's going on here in America? And also, do you think that there will be another government shutdown if Trump does not get his way? Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Mr. Eland.
Well, the first question, I think we always have chaos in the United States. That's part of our system. People who say, well, we don't want so much partisanship. Well, some countries only have one party. So I'm willing to take the partisanship sometimes. Of course, people have to come together to pass a law that's needed or whatever, and that's good when they do that. But well, it may be good if the law is good, but partisan back and forth is good because, as I mentioned, the primary purpose of instituting the Constitution was to avoid tyranny, and that's what our system does. So we have a lot of chaos in it. Now, Russia, certainly during the election, it was illegal to hack the Democratic computers, DNC, and Hillary Clinton campaign. But as far as buying ads on Facebook, Thomas Jefferson said, well, if people are saying false things, what you need to do is put out the truth. So I have less of a problem with Russia doing the latter as opposed to the former, which is an illegal act. So they were trying to cause chaos in our system. But who knows whether they had a demonstrable effect on the election. I guess we'll never really prove that, but certainly they were trying. But what you need to do is our chaos is in our system, and we're supposed to have a give and take, and we're supposed to have different opinions, and I don't think we need lockstep. And I can't remember the second question.
It was about Russia and...
No, that was the first one.
Well, we'll move on to Al, who's
Okay.
waiting in St. Robert, Missouri, a Democrat. Al, go ahead.
Yes, y'all forget what happened in 2013 for the business. That the bill is sitting right there in Mr. Carter's office. Passed out of the Senate, 99 to nothing.
And Al, which bill are you talking about, Al?
Not what Obama saying. Tell the truth.
Al's going a little in and out there. Did you get a question from that?
No, I just...
We can go on to Charlotte in Houston, Texas, a Republican. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
Yeah. Okay, you're talking about the border wall and how Trump is wrong about it. Come on down to the damn southern state and just see how wrong he is, okay? The other thing is, people aren't considering the fact that people who are not coming in here legally bring these. There are two children that came from Honduras that is the same exact thing. They say it's the flu. I don't know if I believe it or not. But you have all sorts of different diseases that have not taken care of in other countries that we have taken care of here. And now we're starting to see them reassert themselves here. It's getting tiresome. I live in Texas. If you hear more Spanish than you hear in English, you fight the jobs here. I'm sorry. When we work elbow to elbow with people who claim that they're coming here because of asylum. It's nonsense. You live here, they work, they make the same amount of money I do. They have a girl that has their baby. They collect welfare. They collect all the goodies that we got here, and they make more money than we do, for God's sake.
Eland.
Well, what you're talking about is the issue of immigration, and that's the basis for this. But what we're really talking about is the president right to override Congress, who said they didn't want a border wall. And the Republicans said this as well by their acquiescence. And even Trump said that by signing the bill. He just decided to sign the bill and then basically do whatever he wanted. And I think that's the issue rather than immigration. Yes, we do need to solve the immigration problem, and there's many different views on that. I personally really think we need a comprehensive solution, both parties getting together. But of course, you know, they've tried that, and we're just divided as a country on the issue. But the real issue here is the Republicans did not go for his wall either, and they've had 2 years of united Republican government to do it, and they haven't provided the money for him, and they didn't do that so this time. So the real question is, does he have the authority to just disregard what the Congress, the legislative body of the United States, has to say, especially when he signed the bill and now he's going off the reservation and declaring an executive emergency? That's the issue, not immigration.
By the way, the caller's other question a few callers back was about your thoughts on the potential for another government shutdown over all of this.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't remember that. I think this was done to avoid the shutdown because Trump was going to get defeated. And so he decided that he would sign this bill so there wouldn't be another shutdown because he was defeated on the first one. He got all sorts of bad publicity and pushback for the first shutdown. He didn't want another shutdown. So he basically agreed to sign the bill, but then he wanted a victory, or he wants to push it into the courts so everybody will forget about it over time. Well, he's certainly hoping the courts will give him a good review, and they may very well do that. But I think this was an attempt to avoid the second shutdown. So if he wanted to shut down again, he would have vetoed the bill. But he signed the bill and then he went against it.
To San Francisco, David's waiting, an independent. Good morning.
Oh, morning. With the distrust of Trump and his financial managing ability, I'm certainly worried about following the money. Where are the accountants going to be for an emergency spending package like this? Is Trump going to be able to cut the budget on the accountants and then leave the taxpayers without the ability to monitor their own money?
Well, I think we also have other oversight abilities. The Government Accountability Office goes into some of that, how the funds are spent and what's happening to them. And I think that's a congressional entity that works for Congress. So now that the Democrats control the House, they can certainly take advantage of that. In fact, they could have taken advantage of it in the minority as well. So I think there are other avenues to monitor this money as it goes out. And of course, you've got a lot of public groups like Public Citizen you mentioned and other groups. And there's also a lot of ranchers down on the border that are suing for this because they don't want their land taken by eminent domain. And many of them are probably pretty conservative because eminent domain has always been an issue for conservatives. So I think there's a variety of ways to push back against this. And I think even if it goes through, you will have some accountability in from the media and from, as I say, organizations like the Government Accountability Office, et cetera.
In today's Washington Post, a quote from the congressman who represents more than 800 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, many of those ranchers that you were talking about. He was on Face the Nation yesterday. Will Hurd, Republican from Texas, opposing President Trump's declaration of a national emergency, warning that it, quote, sets a dangerous precedent. Quote, our government wasn't designed to operate by national emergency. He said, we're almost in uncharted territory. Having this conversation in this last hour of the Washington Journal today. About 20 minutes left with our guest, Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute. If you want to join in, as David did in Evansville, Indiana, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to know your opinion on why do you think we elected Donald Trump, and what do you think is going to happen if a non-elected official such as courts shut him down?
Well, certainly he was elected by the Electoral College, and he's the legitimate president of the United States. But we've had court rulings before that have told presidents that they can't do various things. The courts are, if they have their role, they stick up for people's rights, and they also monitor the checks and balances to make sure one branch doesn't get out of control. And I think the executive branch, not just Donald Trump, but as I mentioned, other presidents, probably since Harry Truman, but certainly since George W. Bush and Obama and Trump, it's really gotten way too powerful from what the framers of the Constitution originally wanted. We don't have a system where electing the president makes him an emperor, and that's the beauty of the system. We do get pushback. And certainly in 1952, the Supreme Court blocked Harry Truman's nationalization of the steel industry, or I should say confiscation of the steel industry. And those steel companies were private companies. And the reason that they did it was because Truman went against, he used his quote unquote inherent power to go against congressional wishes. And that's what we're seeing here. It's an exact relationship between those two events, the Youngstown Steel case in 1952 and what is happening here. And so I think there is a role for courts to monitor the checks and balances that we have in the system and also to ensure people's rights, individuals' rights. Now, we don't have a complete democracy. We have a compound republic, which means there are other branches of governments. There's courts, there's the public pushing back. There's a lot of different things. So just because Trump wins the Electoral College, or any president wins the Electoral College, that doesn't necessarily mean he can do anything he wants, or she can do anything she wants if we have a female president.
As you noted, there's plenty of national emergencies that are still active, more than 30 at this point. Here's a list of a few of them. National emergency having to do with violence in Nicaragua. President Trump declared that last year. President Trump also, to prevent foreign interference in the 2018 election, declared an emergency. Others, 2015, Chinese cyber attacks, a response by the Obama administration, response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, response to the threat of Somali pirates in 2010, the threat of nuclear weapons in North Korea in 2008, and of course in 2001, in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. What do you think should happen to the national emergencies that are still active right now?
Well, I think we need to review the whole thing because I think some of these emergencies, they may even seem like emergencies, but are they really? I mean, to me, a national emergency should be something like 9/11. I think you can make a case that 9/11 was a legitimate national emergency. And of course, Bush did declare, as you just mentioned, but I think the Congress probably should rewrite the National Emergencies Act of 1976 and either abolish national emergencies. They probably won't do that, but they certainly constrict how you can get into one. And I think it has to be really, it should probably be the president can declare it for 2 or 3 or 4 months, and then it just goes out if the Congress doesn't pass it into law. I mean, the founders always believed that the president should have some ability to act in terms of war, even during the declaration of war, which we don't really use anymore, what we should. But even then, the president can respond to a national emergency, whether you want to call it that. I think the framers probably wouldn't want to call it that. But that eventually has to be ratified by Congress. In a war, it would be the declaration of war. In this, it would have to be Congress saying, oh, yes, this is a national emergency. I mean, most of these emergencies that we still have, there's 31 that are left, are putting sanctions against individuals and freezing their assets because they've done something we don't like overseas. And I don't feel that that's a national emergency.
To Andrew, waiting in Louisville, Kentucky, a Republican. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. I just have 2 quick questions for you. My first one being, what is the difference between this national emergency that President Trump has declared and the ones previously by other presidents? And my second question being, the fact that other presidents have spoken on the emergency and the crisis at the border, what has changed and what is different now?
Well, the first question is that the point that I've been making all along here is that the difference between this case is that Trump has gone against what the Congress wants and the bill he just signed. They didn't provide money for the wall. The Republicans haven't provided money for his wall in the last 2 years when they had control of Congress. So I think that's the operating factor. In 1952, we had this Youngstown case with Truman, and they came up with this Judge Jackson, who was on the Supreme Court, came up with this famous way of defining the boundary between executive and legislative power. He said the president is strongest when the Congress has passed a law and he's executing it. In the middle ground was when the Congress hasn't spoken. And then in the worst case is when the Congress speaks on something and the president goes against that because you're not supposed to be able to do that. And that's what Trump is essentially doing here by he signed the bill that the Congress didn't give him his money for his wall, and now he's saying, well, I'm going to do it anyway. Whenever a president says, I have to act because Congress won't, you should admit, whether a Democrat or Republican, and Obama did this as well, you have to say, no, the Congress is supposed to legislate and make the laws, and the president has a veto. If he doesn't veto it, then and it doesn't, and then it can be overridden by the Congress. But so if he signed the bill, you just can't do executive orders or national emergencies or whatever. This has been a problem. And the second question was...
Other presidents have spoken about a border crisis. He said, what's different now when it comes to this border crisis?
Well, I've never really believed in any border crisis. It's more of an immigration crisis rather than a border crisis. Many of the people that are here illegally have overstayed their visa or have come through the ports of entry. And I think what we really need to do is address the factual problem that we have. In fact, Trump is right. The fencing has made a difference in people getting across, because that's going down, and also the price of them, they pay coyotes to smuggle them across, it's dramatically increased. That tells you, an economist, that it's working already. So why do we need a concrete barrier? This is more of a political symbol. But the drug problem, the drug prices are going down, and so the war on drugs has never worked, but I think that's a separate issue that we have to work on, the war on drugs. Do we really need this war on drugs? Because whenever the government declares war on poverty or war on drugs or whatever, it usually doesn't work. So, and it hasn't worked with the drugs. So the drugs are a different problem in itself, but it relates to the border. But I think that other presidents have spoken about this, but the crisis is really... I think in the drug area rather than in the immigration area.
Less than 15 minutes left with Ivan Eland of the Independent Institute. If you want to join the conversation, Republicans, it's 202-748-8001 to call in. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002 on that line for Democrats. Regina's waiting in Chicago. Go ahead. Regina, are you with us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I have a question about the number that President Trump always quotes, that are thousands and thousands of Americans are killed by illegals. Now, I watch a lot of TV. I'm 80 years old. And
go ahead with finish your question, Regina. I think we got the point of Regina's question.
Yes, well, there are obviously crimes committed by people coming into the country. However, I think the statistics show that people coming into the country, if you excuse the fact that they're here illegally, they commit fewer crimes than the people who are from here. So both illegal and legal immigrants have lower crime rates than citizens who've been here for years, who just lived here and didn't immigrate. So I think that's a bit of an overstated problem, and I think the president, frankly, is playing on fear there.
Albuquerque, New Mexico is next. David, Independent, good morning.
Hey, good morning. First of all, I would like to mention that the gangs here in the United States are definitely affiliated with the gangs in Mexico, because, for instance, you have the Aztecas, the Black Hands, you have the Nuestra Familias, you have all these immigrants, illegal immigrants that are in prison. They're talking real bad about America. They hate America, and they don't want nothing to do with America. All they want to do is hurt us. You know, and coming across this border over here, I've been through it many a times. And I guarantee you that what Trump is saying is the truth. You should go out there and spend some time. And you know what? As a matter of fact, you should go to Mexico and see the way they treat you. We don't treat them like that. We want people to come in here legally. As soon as you or anybody else understand the term illegally, that means breaking the law. We have...
Got your point. Ivan Eland.
Well, there are issues with immigration. There's no doubt about it. But what we're talking about here is executive power, and whether this was the right thing for Trump to do as far as an executive order. Certainly, there are gangs that are here, and some of them have ties to Mexico. the MS-13 gang, as I understand it, has ties to Central America. But I once calculated how many people that is, and it was like hundreds of a percent of the immigrants coming into the country. So I think to demonize all immigrants, legal or illegal, by trying to tie them to gangs is a real stretch. And certainly that we have problems. Some immigrants, legal and illegal, in any sort of population commit crimes. But I think it's, as I say, it's less than the people who live here. So I'm not sure that that's a real problem. I don't buy the drugs, crime, and that sort of thing. Now you can say, well, people are coming in and getting benefits and maybe they shouldn't, and that's maybe a legitimate issue. And there may be other legitimate issues. But the real issue here is whether the president should go against the will of Congress and declare a national emergency just because Congress doesn't want to do what he wants, and that is provide $6 billion for a border wall, because we already do have some border fencing, and it seems by the gross figures of people coming in, those barriers have worked to some extent. But do we really need more wall out in the empty desert or the rugged mountainous terrain, those types of places where the drugs and most people come in and drugs come in through the ports of entry?
You mentioned before the 470 national emergencies that had been declared by the time the 1976 National Emergencies Act was passed. It was an effort to rein in some of those. When was the biggest buildup, as it were, of national emergencies before that? And who was creating the most national emergency declarations in the years before 1976?
Well, I'd have to go back and look at that. Actually, I'm not really exactly sure which presidents really pumped up the number. But of course, the whole system was being abused. And that's why the Congress pushed back. And they a lot of these laws, for instance, they passed in 1974 a Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And it was supposed to, Richard Nixon was impounding funds, which is related to this thing. He was just saying, no, we're not going to spend. We need to reduce the government spending, which is a laudable goal. But the president doesn't really have the power to do that. So Congress wanted to pass a new law. Well, what did Gerald Ford do immediately after gaining office? Was he used the law that was supposed to curtail impoundments to increase impoundments. So that this emergency law has been used to continue emergencies. Now, it has cut down the number of emergencies from hundreds to 31, and they are sunsetting some of them because we've had 59 emergencies since they passed the law in 1976, and now we're down to 31, so about half of those were sunset. So the law is working. I'm not sure which president is most guilty of this because it just built up over time, 470, but that's what they were trying to push back on. They were trying to push back on the executive just declaring national emergencies over trivial things. And I still think we're declaring national emergencies over trivial things, but fortunately the number has shrunk. Now maybe there'll be pushback on this in Congress either after Trump leaves office or maybe even while he's leaving office. And if that's the case, then there will be a positive aspect of this, I think.
Out to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Pedro is a Republican. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't understand where anyone don't think this is an emergency. And I can't believe that this guy just said that the president was right about these walls do stop people from coming over. I mean, where's he getting his facts from, the Mexican government or where?
Mr. Eland.
Well, I said the border fencing that they have has seemed to at least have some effect on people coming across because it's gone down. Now, that's not the only reason. I think you're seeing a Mexican economy that's better, and also the U.S. had a recession in 2008, which probably, I think there was a net outflow after that because people go where the jobs are. And certainly, but the real key question, do we need a concrete wall over 2,000 miles? And that's what Trump originally said he was going to do. That's more symbolic because you can see some of the border fencing and other factors have reduced the number of people, and it's also raised the price to get smugglers to bring people across the border. That's an indication that something has worked, and these border fences probably do in certain places. But I don't think the Democrats have opposed the border fencing and even adding border fencing in certain places. What they are objecting to, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of Republicans who are objecting to this concrete barrier as well. They may not be always saying it, but they had 2 years to give Trump money for this, because it's not just going to cost the $6 billion that's being talked about here. It's probably going to be 23 to 25 billion. And in my experience, I used to be a congressional investigator. That price tag is going to go up because no government program ever came in on budget or on time. So I think it's going to cost much more than that. And the question is, do we really need a wall for 2,000 miles? And that's what we're talking about here.
By the way, we're expected to hear more from the president later this afternoon. He's going to be in Miami. The subject of his address is an address to the Venezuelan American community, but we'll see what the president has to say. Rick on Twitter has a question for you, and you've touched on this a little bit when you talked about many of these emergency declarations involve freezing the U.S. assets of foreign nationals. But Rick wants to know if you can categorize national emergencies to compare the reasons why they were declared.
Well, I would say that's the main reason that most of these 31 are still on the books, is that he's able to declare a national emergency, and you have to have some sort of a legal reason for seizing people's assets in the United States. The government can't just go in and seize people's assets, but many of these people have are foreigners who have assets in the country, because we have a safe haven for investments. So a lot of money from Russia, from autocratic countries, from other countries comes in here, and so many of these instances are where you have to get some sort of legal authority to freeze this person's asset, maybe a Russian oligarch or whatever, and also saying that the United States, people in the United States can't do business with these people because they've done human rights problem. They're a weapons proliferator. They're a smuggler of nuclear material. Whatever it is they're doing, it's usually a national security thing, or a way of disapproving of the conduct of some of these leaders for human rights or otherwise. So that's why they do this, and they feel that they need this legal reason to seize assets and to declare, your persona non grata for commerce with our citizens and our government, and therefore they declare this national emergency. Now, if national emergencies were held to this, that I guess that would be something. I choose to call it something else, legal authority to freeze assets or something, because I think the national emergency thing can be taken much too wide, and that's what we're seeing here.
Time for maybe one or two more calls before the end of our program. Mohammed is in Reston, Virginia, a Democrat. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, thank you. My biggest issue is that all these numbers that are being thrown out, statistics. The first thing you know about statistics, polling numbers are always biased. I think the more imperative issues that we as Americans, we have things that need to be taken care of, not walls. We need education, we need health care, we need to address the gun issues. 30,000 plus people are dying on an annual basis. That's just my comment.
Do you think there should be a national emergency when it comes to gun violence in this country?
I think that needs to happen.
Ivan Eland, how would you feel about that?
Well, I think that's what the Republicans are scared of, that the next president, if it's a Democrat, would come in and say, well, we have a national emergency over climate change. We have a national emergency over gun violence, so I'm going to ban all guns, or they probably wouldn't go that far, but that we're going to have more gun restrictions, et cetera. And so the real problem with this is that people are scared, including Republicans, both privately and some of them publicly, are saying, well, this opens a can of worms. If the president can just take a law and say he doesn't like it and do whatever he wants, then don't we have rule by fiat? Don't we have tyranny? And of course, that's what the founders of the country wanted to avoid. So I think that's the point. The point is that this can be abused at a new level, and it's very scary, because the primary function of Congress and the biggest power it has is to provide money, and the Constitution says you will not spend money unless the Congress appropriates it. And that's what Trump is essentially doing here. One other point, we always talk about the border problem, people coming in, but there's another problem which we don't hear too much about, and that is the violence in Mexico is fueled by U.S. gun shipments. There's a huge gun export from the U.S. to Mexico, and so that's part of the problem as well, in the violence in Mexico.
We'll have to end it there. Ivan Eland is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, also the author of the book War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Republic After Congressional Failure. That's coming out later this spring. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News, and for the last 15 years I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.